taking time for your health. The African American Wellness Watch. Trusted information for us, by us. Dr. Mike LeNoir and other experts from around the country and around the world have the latest on how you and your family can get healthy and stay well. It's time for the African American Wellness Watch.
Welcome to today's special edition of the Wellness Watch. I'm your host, Dr. Mike LeNoir. We have the special privilege of having Dr. Rahn Bailey. He's the chief of psychiatry at Louisiana State University, the chief of the jail cell group of psychiatrists in New Orleans, and the assistant dean of community engagement. Dr. Bailey is located in New Orleans, a very special place to talk about mental health. Welcome to our program, Dr. Bailey.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for having me, Dr. LeNoir.
Obviously, the events of New Year's Day have changed the landscape across the country, maybe even across the world. But certainly in the city of New Orleans, how is the city of New Orleans handling that?
Well, by definition, your points are correct. The tragedy of January 1st, 2025 will live with us in infamy forever. My team, our doctors, our clinical staff, our entire community, I think was shocked and surprised at the level of vulnerability that I think we all share. I mean, that's a corner that I think I've stood on and many New Orleans have, not just dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times, on the corner of Canal and Bourbon Street next to Big Marriott. Is a very popular corner in town for engagement, people in town for an activity, a conference. It's just right in the middle of the action and a very fun-loving place, to be honest with you. I think that a few things come to mind. First, I think this acknowledges, our relative vulnerability as Americans, as citizens, in societies that increasingly are more at risk than we care to believe and initially considered. I also think that the prospect that more of these issues are occurring may drive individuals to be more fearful of their own safety. They may stay in more and not feel comfortable going out to engage, to restaurants, to events, to the aquarium, the conferences, but also I think less likely to want to be with their entire family, people they should actually protect, their children, their spouses, what have you, in these settings. So it had a significant impact, I think, on all of us, and it may do so for a long time. We really need to get to the bottom of what we can do as psychiatrists to help manage these concerns and prevent them going forward.
Yeah, the reason it has had such a resonance around the world and certainly around the country is because it's piling on top of so many stressful situations that our populations are having to deal with. Certainly the election of a new president was, regardless of what you think, creates tension in a lot of people. And then the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East. In fact, today, as I understand it, there is some kind of a ceasefire settlement, which maybe calm things down just a little bit. And this all becomes a collective stress on the general population, does it not?
It does. Clearly, I think that these issues are cumulative. By definition, as you point out, there's a collective stress. It's growing. It's incremental. All too often, more things happen to add lighter fluid to the fire, so to speak. Very little adds water and douses the fire. So many of us have a growing sense of anxiety and concern. Some would call it discernment. I mentioned earlier, more fear and disbelief than a concept that one might be able to manage these problems and handle it. In psychiatry, we often talk about defense mechanisms, and it's my impression that all too often more of these events work toward overwhelming one's normative defense mechanisms. And at that point, if you can't handle it, you may develop some degree of psychic stress, which can lead to psychiatric diagnoses and problems, anxiety, depression, other forms of affective illness. These, I think, are our concerns going forward.
When we grew up in Texas, and obviously we grew up with a set of values and principles. The perpetrator in this attack came from Beaumont. You're from Beaumont, and I'm from Dallas, so Beaumont is a small Texas town to me. But we don't need to go into that. But he looked so normal. He looked so sensible. He looked like your neighbor next door. what are we missing in our society that we cannot identify and call and strip around the various layers to get to the kind of frustration he had that led to him being, recruited?
Well, it really is an operational term. The reality is Beaumont is middle America, born and raised there, about 100 miles from Houston. But like thousands and thousands of other small cities and medium-sized towns, regular people do regular things. As I understand, this individual was a regular person who went to school and maybe worked a job and engaged with persons and didn't show any outward signs of aberrant behavior or violent tendencies or any undue risk. As I understand, this is what we're beginning to see more regularly, not just in that event of January 1st, 2025 here in New Orleans, but in many of these similar circumstances around the country, persons who many others would have deemed as normal in their actions, behavior, and past history are engaging in remarkably abnormal and violent actions. And that's just very difficult, I think, for us to make heads or tails of, make sense of as professionals. As a psychiatrist, I think we have an additional responsibility. I think one that's a responsibility we should embrace to try to get to the bottom of it and understand how we might be able to be much more forward thinking in our approaches, progressive, I think, in our actions, and develop strategies that allow society to be preventative in our approach. Clearly, one thing that does happen is when psychiatrists make a recommendation to limit someone's freedom, society should give us more authority to do so. I'm not so sure that society, and it would have worked in this case. Nobody took him to the hospital and tried to get him committed. But throughout my career, Dr. LeNoir, in a 30-plus year career as a psychiatrist, it's been more difficult than it had been in the past for me when you try to get somebody admitted to a psych hospital because of perceived future dangerousness for that to happen. All too often, the concept has become a person can only be admitted to a hospital once they're already engaged in a violent act. I think that's too much. That goes too far, and that puts society too much at risk. That should change.
A question for you. This is a situation that continues to recur. Here's a man, though, however, who's just not mad at his family or mad at the neighborhood, but who was completely converted philosophically. As pediatricians, for instance, we took on the issue of, let's say, something like cold and cough medicine. And we decided collectively that we were going to stop the purchase of cough medicine for young children. You belong to a number of organizations, National Medical Association. Certainly, I probably several psychiatry associations. What are these associations saying about what we can collectively do differently in our societies to either identify or prevent something like this from happening because of a change in a mentality as subtle as this?
Well, there's certainly three things that come to mind, and I'm sure there are more, but for your audience, I'd say, early in my career, mine and yours, we were trained as physicians that there were 4 vital signs: temperature and breathing capacity, and whether you had any heart rate and your pulse. At some point in my career, we decided to add pain as a 5th vital sign. Now, I earnestly believe that violence or violent tendencies should be a 6th vital sign, metaphorically. At every visit, every doctor should ask some questions about a risk of violence. You'd be surprised at how often, unbeknownst to you, a person will admit earnestly and honestly that they are having thoughts toward violence, whether they want to hurt themselves inwardly at a high risk of suicide or somebody else outwardly. Because very often we are uncomfortable asking that question, they can linger and harbor for a long period of time before either it spills out accidentally. The kid who does a bad thing in school, and then the principal and the teachers and the police ask, did anybody know it? And somebody says, well, last week he said this was really a bad thing. Nobody went and told. A second thing I think is also true that we may be able to do much better is be proactive, not only in asking that question, but following up with how does that link to what you would do in a circumstance. If I ask somebody, are you violent? They may say no or what have you. But if I give them a hypothetical and ask, what would you do if this situation occurred? Again, I remain very surprised in my current clinical practice how often individuals don't have the so-called defense strategies or compensatory strategies to work through stressors and problems without resorting straight to violence. We go from having a good relationship, everything is fine, to violence without any much in the middle. So we haven't really worked to develop those kinds of ego strengths that help you kind of think through rationally in a normal ego format. How do you handle problems and conflict and stress? I think more people than we realize fall in that category. The third and final point I simply argue is that when we do engage, resources have to be available to treat. It's an old psychiatric story, but all too often, if you don't have private funds, we can't, and until you've preventatively, and if you can't show that you've already committed a violent act, well, then all the resources show up. Then you go to a hospital and you're committed and you're inpatient hospitalization, medications and management, residential therapy. Too much happens. I'm sorry, on the back end, we should put more on the front end for prevention.
I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. You read about this guy, you read about his background, you read about his experiences and his transition to a more active terrorist group. Give me a mental status based upon, I don't expect you to make a clear diagnosis, but give me a mental status from what you read and what you heard.
The big seven, was he oriented? Yes. So he wouldn't show anybody an overt sign of a problem. He knew who he was and where he was, what the date was, basic stuff. Next, what was his behavior? It was calm and cooperative. I mean, he was able to engage. He wasn't, walk around in a very aberrant or aggressive or agitated kind of fashion. He didn't show any overt signs. They showed pictures of him ride on his bicycle down Bourbon Street a week or two before. So he was able to kind of fit in, and that didn't draw any adverse attention to him, which may have sent him to authorities. Next, we actually moved toward mood and affect. And his mood probably was a bit sullen. He may have been a bit distant. Some argue that he may have been a bit isolated in some circumstances, but not enough, I think, to draw the adverse attention of someone who was acutely depressed and crying and sobbing and dysphoric and really irritable and angry and moving toward a violent type action. His affect, how he engaged, again, allowed him to kind of fit in. It may have been a little bit odd to some, but not enough, I think, to draw the overt attention of someone who would want to hospitalize the person going forward. And the last three are his thought processes. They were probably goal-oriented. It took a lot to kind of think through and plan in a logical fashion. He wasn't illogical or disorganized, overtly having signs of a psychotic disorder, like having schizophrenia. And his thought content, although not harboring any overt violence toward himself, may have regularly had thoughts that he kind of kept amongst himself of homicidal ideation, want to hurt others. And all too often, what we tend to see a person who are paranoid. And one of the challenges with the symptom of paranoia, even with the mental status exam, is that very often it's the one that's the least likely to be detected externally by someone who's not a professional. So your friends and others around you won't detect that. Psychiatrists should be adept at doing so of all of our training. But unless you volunteer and tell someone you're paranoid and fearful, you think that somebody psychotically from the Martians will come and get you from away, or you may think somebody who lives right next door to you is peeping on you, spying on you. If you don't volunteer those things, regular lay people, it doesn't come to their attention, there's going to be a problem. Cognitively, he's fully intact. He could think, his concentration, attention, and memory are all in order. So the area I think that should be focused on is his thought content. It probably was latent with frank paranoia.
Yeah, so, and obviously this is not, we wouldn't stamp this as the evaluation in terms of its applied application to him, because you didn't have a chance to sit and talk with him. So I don't want people to misinterpret that. You're definitely saying he was paranoid, but based upon what you've seen, it certainly sounds like a possibility. So now let me ask you finally in terms, here's where I think a lot of this stuff starts. And I think it starts because we as physicians in primary care are not paying enough attention to the 4 or 5 things that you mentioned when we see patients. We're under a lot of pressure, we're under a lot of stress. We know about the social determinants, we know about the psychiatric possibilities. Yet we don't seem to be able to incorporate effectively into our histories and physicals enough of the information about the mental status of patients. Do you think that needs to change?
Absolutely. So I think that you're ahead of your time. The reality is there are some aspects of other disciplines in medicine that I have to consider as a psychiatrist. We're trained, for example, that before you can make a psychiatric diagnosis, you should rule out medical. So a person should have gone to some other doctor at least once a year and got a physical and had baseline labs and ensure that we're not missing something. Before I diagnose clinical depression, I should ensure that you don't have hypothyroidism, for example, which can present looking exactly the same as clinical depression. I think that analogy carries over to psychiatry. We would be wise in our society to have an all hands on deck approach to decrease the risk and increase prevention of these kind of violent acts. More clinicians and all physicians should regularly be thoughtful and demonstrative of this concept, as you point out, I think very articulately, of a mental status exam. We shouldn't wait until there's an initial consideration of a problem before we send someone to a psychiatrist for a formal assessment. Anymore, there's a psychiatrist, somebody walks in my office limping and they said they had a traumatic accident of their leg, maybe they have a broken leg, I got to get them to a doctor to manage that. I shouldn't ignore that and say, well, that's somebody else's area. We all should think that how a person thinks and engages, that's important. And we all should recognize that we have an opportunity to have a blanket of an assessment strategy that is far-reaching, much more likely, I think, to have a high sensitivity, so to speak, and to catch or capture more persons who may be at some risk. It's also true that physicians and clinicians who are not psychiatrists are more likely to hear a story from an individual rather than psychiatrists. Of our 30+ thousand suicides every year, almost 40,000 many years, the data remains that over half have seen a professional within 30 days of committing suicide. Or the person who's still professional, over half of those persons saw an individual that was not, I repeat, that was not a psychiatrist, either a non-psychiatric mental health professional or a non-psychiatrist MD physician. So all clinicians should have this as a higher index of suspicion. We should all be very mindful and thoughtful of the problems that are likely to occur overall incrementally if we don't capture these problems early and create some degree of successful interventional strategy. That's not happening enough in our society. And although this issue in New Orleans is today's discussion, I'm really concerned about the bigger issue of how often this kind of problem is happening all over the country.
Well, I think one final question. How do you think the city of New Orleans has changed based upon this incident?
Become much more insular. I think fewer people will want to be out, period. More persons trying to figure out what they can do to protect themselves and limit their risk. There's been a lot of discussion about putting up barriers and whether the mayor or the chief of police had ordered the barriers. It's unfortunate, in my opinion, my professional opinion. Those are all professional actions, and I'm not here to criticize any of them. But when someone really wants to hurt large numbers of persons, an individual really does not care about or have disdain for getting caught, it's remarkably difficult to stop it. What generally allows you to stop a problem is the person trying to figure out their getaway plan. But now with these so-called kamikaze-like actions, going back, 50 years ago to pilots that would fly their plane into a ship, knowing that they were going to die, or the 911 actions of so many years ago when the same issue was in play, 25 years ago almost. The reality is it's very difficult to prevent these issues from happening behaviorally once a person decides they're going to engage in it and they don't mind if there's any way that somebody's going to get caught. The way to limit these risks is for psychiatry and mental health professionals to have more access, earlier access, and earlier attempts at interventional strategies to capture people with a wide net, a highly sensitive net of persons early on who may be having a problem, and then to be able to intervene. There are people who probably know this individual is being what we call radicalized, and that can in some settings be linked to some degree of aberrant action. You got to sit down and you got to talk about it. You got to hear what somebody's thinking. Very often the psychiatrists about action and thought and behavior. You have to hear what somebody's thinking. They've got to tell you for you to have a better idea what it might be to do to limit the risk. We must do that better in America going forward, or my unfortunate perspective is that these problems are likely to continue before they get better.
Dr. Bailey, this was really a unique opportunity for us to talk to someone right on the ground, able to make some observations, not only about the act itself, but about the general reaction of people to the act and some suggestion about how we as clinicians can get together and cast a wider tent, be more focused in our evaluations and incorporate a better mental status evaluation. So thank you so much for joining us today, because I know it's a very busy time for you. So today, I think it'll be this unique opportunity to Dr. Rahn Bailey. Clearly, we need to make some changes in our society. We in the African American Wellness Project are going to continue to try and talk to professionals like this. We know that over the next several years, you're not going to have access to a lot of the things that you've taken for granted in the area of health. And we're going to try to supplement and patch that with continued information about what's going on, with analysis of what's happened, and some of the ways in which you can take advantage of the healthcare system for you and your family. So as we always end our program, we say health is our biggest asset. Health is your biggest asset. So protect it.